Chapter 41. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Now, did you notice just what respect was paid to Joseph? People bowed down in front of him. Now, that didn't usually happen with a vizier. But it so happens that under Sesostris I, we know from history that there was such a vizier, and his name was Mentuhotep. The very well-known Egyptologist Brugsch described the activities of this vizier. I want you to listen to what it says. In a word, our Mentuhotep, who was also invested with several priestly dignities and was Pharaoh's treasurer, appears as the alter ego of the king. When he arrived, the great personages bowed down before him. So you see, this fits in very well with the biblical account, and we do have such a vizier under Sesostris I. But there's other evidence too to support what I'm saying. Well, here we are in the Fayum, this remarkable oasis that supports so many people, and here I think is something very significant. You see this canal, it's a very large canal, and it comes a long way and flows into this oasis which is below sea level and enters a vast lake, and it brings fertility to this whole area. Now, the interesting part is that this is called Joseph's Canal, and nobody knows where it got that name. It seems to go back a long way. And it is my opinion that this canal, which was dug during the 12th dynasty, the early 12th dynasty, was dug during the time of Joseph, who knew that a 7-year famine was coming, and so he had this canal dug to provide fertility to the land of Egypt during this time. Now, there's something else I think is very significant, and that is further downstream is a place called Beni Hassan. And at Beni Hassan there are some tombs. And one of these tombs has on the wall a beautiful painting, well, it used to be beautiful, it's faded now, of some Semitic immigrants who had come into Egypt. And there it shows the type of clothing they wore, the type of domestic animals they had, the type of weapons, and you'll even notice that this fellow had brought his portable TV with him. Well, actually, it's a musical instrument anyway. So this shows the Semitic immigrants during the 12th dynasty. Now, who were they? I don't say that they were Joseph and his family, but I do consider it highly likely that they were the Israelite people who had fanned out over the land, and this man thought it significant enough to put it on the wall of his tomb. Now, there's one more thing I want to tell you about. One of these tombs was made by a man by the name of Amoni, and he also was during the time of Sesostris I. And he left on the wall of his tomb a record of his good deeds. That's what they mostly did, you know, told the gods what a good fellow they were. And among other things, he referred to what he did to prepare for a coming famine. Now, Jan will read you a statement from a historian and a translation of this wall inscription.
"No one was unhappy in my days, not even in the years of famine. For I had tilled all the fields of the nome of Mar up to its southern and northern frontiers. Thus I prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food which it produced."
And so I consider all of this points to the fact that Sesostris I was the pharaoh under whom Joseph was the vizier of Egypt. Now we come to the 5th king of the 12th dynasty, whose name was Sesostris III. And I consider him to be the Pharaoh referred to in the book of Exodus chapter 1 and in verse 8, where it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them." Well, I consider that by now Joseph would be dead, and this would be the Pharaoh referred to in this verse. And believe me, he's a nasty looking character, just the sort of fellow you would expect to do this sort of thing. For instance, there is this statue of him in the Cairo Museum. Do you notice the downturned, sour mouth that he's got and the nasty expression? And then here's another statue of him, a similar appearance. And then here is this sphinx of him. I just wouldn't like to know this fellow. And I think he's the pharaoh referred to here. Sesostris III was followed by Amenemhet III. And he also was a nasty-looking character, as his statues indicate. Here's one, for instance, in the Luxor Museum. And he reigned for 43 years. This is his pyramid that he built here. Not a very big pyramid of today, but originally it was covered with stone and a lot bigger than this. Today, all that is left is the core of the pyramid, which is made of mud bricks that are laced with straw. In fact, you can see the little flecks of straw that were in there. And after all, that's what we would expect, isn't it? Because here in Exodus chapter 5 and in verse 7 it says, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make brick as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves." So I think that this was the Pharaoh who was responsible for this. Another interesting point is that Amenemhet III had a daughter, no sons, and that daughter had no children. Her name was Sebek-Nefru-Re. And this would explain why she went down to the river Nile and saw the little baby Moses in a basket there. You might wonder, well now, why would an Egyptian princess take a little baby from the slaves and propose to make him the next pharaoh? Well, you see, she wasn't down there having a bath or taking a swim. She was down there for ceremonial purposes, worshipping the god Hapi, the river god, the Nile god, and he was the fertility god. And of course, she'd need a god like that if she was infertile. And so she was down there worshipping the god Hapi, the fertility god. All right, and so she sees this little baby comes along and regards it as a gift of the fertility god Hapi. And I think probably she called him Hapi Moses. You see, Moses means drawn out of, or born of. In other words, born of the river god Hapi. There are a number of pharaohs called that. For instance, there was Tutmosis, born of the god Tut. There was Ramoses, or Ramesses, born of the god Ra. So here we have Moses, born of the god Hapi. Well, he was the baby who was to become the next pharaoh, but he disappears off the scene. And it's not hard to understand why. There was a king by the name of Amenemhet IV, who was intended to be the heir of Amenemhet III. But suddenly he disappears from the scene. I think that was Moses myself, because he was forced to flee at the end of this man's reign. And so we come to the end of this dynasty, and I think it fits in very well with what we know of the biblical history. Well, now we're visiting the tomb of Sesostris II. You see it over there in the distance? Also a mud brick pyramid. And this particular pyramid was made by Sesostris II, and it was excavated by Sir Flinders Petrie in the year 1891. And Rosalie David published a book only in 1986 in which she highlighted some of the discoveries made by Petrie. And he found that there was an entire city here which was occupied by Semitic slaves, if you please. We'll go to the top of the pyramid and I'll point out the city from there. Well, I don't want to have to climb that pyramid every hot summer day, but from here you can look out and see where the temple was and where the city was that Petrie excavated. Now, he found evidence there that it had been occupied by the workmen who lived and who worked on building these pyramids. And he concluded from the evidence that they were Semitic slaves. Now, there's something else that he found too. This book by Egyptologist Rosalie David was only published in 1986, and it is on the people who built the pyramids, the actual workmen, you see. It has in particular here a chapter called The Foreign Population at Kahun. And It says, from his excavations at Cahoon, Petrie formed the opinion that a certain element of the population there had come from outside Egypt. Now, the archaeologists couldn't figure out who this foreign population were. It says here, it is apparent that the Asiatics, now an Asiatic is a term that the Egyptians used for somebody from Syria or Palestine or somewhere in that region. The Asiatics were present in the town in some numbers, and this may have reflected the situation elsewhere in Egypt. It can be stated that these people were loosely classed by Egyptians as Asiatics, although their exact homeland in Syria or Palestine cannot be determined. Now, the reason that they could not determine it is because I consider they have the wrong chronology. Therefore, they did not associate them with the Israelite slaves. I believe they should be identified as the Israelite slaves. It says the reason for their presence in Egypt remains unclear. In other words, we don't know who they were or how they came to be in Egypt. But put it with the biblical account and you have the answer. They were enslaved by the Pharaoh. Of particular interest, I think, is something that Petrie found under the floors there. There were boxes. Do you see the picture of the box here? Very well preserved. And this box was found under the floor, as boxes were under many of the floors of the homes. And it says larger wooden boxes, probably used originally to store clothing and other possessions, were discovered underneath the floors of many houses at Cahoon. They contained babies, sometimes buried 2 or 3 to a box and aged only a few months at deaths. I think that's very significant. How did they get there? Well, we know from the biblical record that Pharaoh decreed that all the baby boys were to be put to death at birth. Some of the mothers managed to look after their babies for a month or 2 or 3 months, as with Moses, but then I can see the Egyptians coming along, wrenching them from the arms of the Israelite mothers, killing them, and the loving parents burying them in these boxes under their floors. One more significant point about this is as to where all these Asiatic slaves went to. Interesting, listen. There are different opinions of how this first period of occupation at Cahoon drew to a close. The quantity, range, and type of articles of everyday use which were left behind in the houses may indeed suggest that the departure was sudden and unpremeditated. Now, how can slaves just suddenly pack up and leave? Just drop everything and leave. And here's the evidence that this is what happened. It's unbelievable unless you accept the biblical account that all these Israelite slaves just suddenly left Egypt in the great Exodus movement. I read to you what the biblical account says in Exodus chapter 12 and in verse 41. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that self-same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Well, personally, I think that explains why these slaves left suddenly and unpremeditatively. Now, archaeologists say, generally, that there is no record in Egypt of the Exodus or of the Israelite slaves, for that matter. Well, I think that's because they were looking for it in the wrong place. They're looking for it at the end of the 18th or 19th dynasty, but if you look for it at the end of the 12th dynasty, I believe you do find a record. You see, these 10 plagues that fell on Egypt prior to the Exodus were absolutely devastating. Listen, Exodus 7, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The fish that were in the river died. The Egyptians could not drink the water of the river. Well, whether they actually turned to blood or looked like blood doesn't matter. The point is, they couldn't drink the water. Chapter 9, the hand of the Lord will be on your cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, sheep, a very severe pestilence. All the livestock of Egypt died. Well, you can see how Egypt is dependent upon its livestock, and if they all dropped dead, it must have been an absolute disaster. Then we read, Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail. The hail struck throughout the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. All their fruit trees were devastated. And so it absolutely shattered the economy of Egypt. And the locusts went up over all the land of Egypt and rested on all the territory of Egypt. They were very severe. And they covered the face of the whole earth so that the land was darkened. They ate every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. Here you've got beautiful crops here, but they're all destroyed by locusts, hail, thunder, everything. And Egypt was absolutely laid in the dust. Well, there should have been some record of all this in Egypt if it really happened, and I believe there is a record if you look in the right place. In the Leiden Museum in Holland, there is a papyrus there called the Ipuwer Papyrus, and it's to be dated to this time. Now you listen, Jan's going to read you a translation of it.
Plague stalketh through the land, and blood is everywhere. Nay, but many dead men are buried in the river. Nay, but the river is blood. Does a man drink thereof? He rejects it as a human. Nay, but gates, columns, and walls are consumed with fire. Nay, but corn has perished everywhere. The storehouse is bare.
So, you see, when we look in the right place, we find that you can take the biblical record seriously and it all fits into place.
In our next program, we leave the pyramids of Egypt and travel south to the tombs and temples of Luxor and Karnak. There we will further investigate how biblical history can be both complemented and brought alive by historical facts and archaeological discoveries. Luxor was the capital of Egypt during the reign of King Tutankhamun, and in the rugged hills of the West Bank lies the famed Valley of the Kings, whilst to the east, the beautiful temples of Luxor and Karnak.